A black businesswoman boards her first-class seat like she's done countless times before, but this flight? Everything changes. A fellow passenger demands she move to economy, claiming she doesn't belong, not knowing she's the CEO of the airline. What happens next silences the entire cabin, and by the time they land, he's escorted off the plane in shame. What follows sparks headlines, soul-searching, and a reckoning no one could have predicted. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary flight, until it wasn't. It was not Paris that startled her, it never had. It was the way the world looked at her in Paris that still, after all her triumphs, carried the chill of an old insult. Dr. Naomi Clark walked the polished floors of Charles de Gaulle Terminal 2F with the grace of a woman who had earned her space in every room. Every room except, perhaps, the one she was about to enter, the one with the plush leather seats, the foie gras menu, the silence dressed in suits and old money, first class. Behind her trailed two shadows. They wore smiles disguised as stillness. Private security, yes, but not for show. They were there because Naomi had learned long ago that brilliance alone wouldn't shield a black woman from the sharp edges of the world. She was flying home from meetings that would shake the bones of tech empires. Her firm, Clark Systems, had just secured an EU-wide educational contract linking disenfranchised schools across 3 continents. The deal would elevate thousands. Yet, as Naomi handed over her boarding pass, the gate agent did what so many had done before. They blinked at her name like it was in the wrong mouth. She did not flinch. That had been trained out of her by the time she was 10. In the lounge, she crossed paths with a man named Douglas Weller, a name that clung to his chest like it was proof of dominion. He was broad, red-faced, the kind of man who measured the world in ownership. He saw Naomi, took her piece by piece, then dismissed her with a glance that said, "Not here. Not in this tier." Naomi had been dismissed before. She wore dismissal like a second coat, one that didn't quite fit anymore. She boarded first, as was her right. Her seat, 1A, waited with a blanket folded just so, a glass of still water sweating on the tray. She barely noticed Douglas as he climbed aboard. But he noticed her, and the rage in his silence was louder than any announcement overhead. He sat across the aisle and stared, his entitlement pacing just beneath the skin. Naomi had dealt with men like him in boardrooms, in banks, in the corner offices of hedge funds and federal contracts. Men who believed her presence was an accident that time had yet to correct. When the cabin filled, the quiet became dangerous. The type of quiet that comes before a storm, not one made of thunder and wind, but of words, sharp and lodged like glass in the throat. He spoke low, then louder, then boldly. "You don't belong here," Douglas said, his voice curved with a smile. "This is first class." Naomi looked up, as one might at an insect. "I paid for my seat," she said. "And I plan to enjoy it." And that, dear reader, was when everything began to unpeel. Not the comfort of leather seats. Not the calm of a transatlantic voyage. But the mask. The fragile mask of civility that this world wears when it sees black excellence and cannot stand the reflection. The stewardess stumbled toward the chaos, apologies ready. But Naomi didn't rise. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. Because dignity doesn't explain itself to arrogance. Her hand moved in a signal. And just like that, Douglas Weller learned what happens when you mistake quiet dignity for absence of power. He didn't know it yet, but he had chosen the wrong woman, the wrong seat, the wrong day. And the reckoning would begin at 36,000 feet. You must understand something, and I pray you hear me well, because this world does not say it aloud. A black woman in a place of comfort is always seen as a threat before she is seen as a person. Dr. Naomi Clark had taken her seat. Not stolen. Not borrowed it. Not stumbled upon it by accident. She had paid for it, earned it through brilliance, persistence, and a willingness to walk through fire barefoot while being told to smile. And yet, here she sat, the hum of the aircraft a low chorus behind the growing tension, as Douglas Weller fumed beside her like some colonial remnant that had been shaken awake too soon from his dream of dominion. He said nothing at first. But racism is rarely silent for long. It itches. It simmers. It seeks an audience. Naomi was reviewing notes for her keynote at the UN, on global digital equity, no less, when his voice crawled across the aisle. I just don't see why they let everyone in here now. The words were not directed at her, but they were about her. And everyone knew it. That, my friend, is the cruelty of the modern racial insult. It arrives dressed in vagueness so that when you name it, they call you the one who made it about race. Naomi didn't flinch. She knew this game. The subtle art of degradation. The poke disguised as opinion. The venom cloaked it in conversation. Flight attendants approached, offering beverages. Douglas smiled at them as if nothing had passed from his mouth but air. That's how it often goes. Those who wound us do so in a whisper and smile in the presence of witnesses. He began again, louder this time, emboldened by the silence. Seems like we're letting just anyone buy prestige these days, he muttered, swirling his drink. Naomi looked at him, not with anger, but with something worse, recognition. You mean people like me, she said evenly, not blinking. Douglas laughed, a short, bitter sound. Don't twist my words. But you've already twisted them, she replied, just enough to pretend you didn't say what you said. The white woman seated beside him shifted in her chair. A businessman in the second row raised his eyebrows, but said nothing. No one wanted to be part of the scene. That's the great American pastime. Watch, wince, but don't interfere. And that, too, is how racism survives, not through the boldness of men like Douglas, but through the silence of the many who fear discomfort more than they fear injustice. Naomi turned her face back to the window. But Douglas wouldn't let it go. Tell me, he said with forced politeness, what exactly is it that you do, Miss Clark? She smiled without warmth. I rebuild what men like you try to destroy. The quiet that followed was volcanic. This wasn't the rage of the 1960s. This wasn't fire hoses or snarling dogs. This was the cold warfare of class and color, a man incensed not because she had wronged him, but because she had escaped the cage he imagined for her. He hated that she walked like she belonged. He hated that no one had stopped her at the gate. He hated that her skin wore success the way he did entitlement. And he hated most of all that she was unafraid. The flight moved on. The cabin dimmed. And Naomi, after sending one final message to her team, closed her eyes. But the moment had changed. The air was different. Because now the whole cabin knew, and no one could unknow. And still no one spoke. Except for one stewardess, who leaned toward Naomi with eyes that glistened just slightly and whispered, I see you. If you need anything, you let me know. It was enough. Not everything, but enough. Because you see, we do not survive these moments expecting the world to save us. We survive them because we carry ourselves whole in places built to break us into parts. Naomi did not yet know that this encounter would not end at 30,000 feet. That the sickness in Douglas Weller would not stay in its seat. That her silence would soon be mistaken for surrender. But she felt it. In the air. In the way the stewardess looked back. In the crackle of a world always on the brink of showing its real face. Because sometimes, when you sit where they say you shouldn't, the storm doesn't just come to you. You become the storm. It is not always the blow that bruises, it is the refusal to see the wound. The plane hummed along its night path over the Atlantic, cutting silently through darkness. But within its most exclusive cabin, something far older than jet fuel powered the tension, the unspoken but unmistakable rage of a man confronting a world that no longer bowed to him. Dr. Naomi Clark sat in her seat, poised like a cathedral, enduring like stone. Douglas Weller, meanwhile, festered in his. And when a certain kind of man festers, it is not long before the infection spreads. He had gone quiet after their earlier exchange, but quiet is never safe. Not when it comes from a man who has been told no by a woman he cannot control, and especially not when that woman's skin carries the memory of centuries he prefers to forget. The flight attendant, Lauren, the one who had dared to whisper, "I see you," had checked on Naomi once or twice with gentle eyes, the kind of kindness that risks something. But the rest of the cabin had gone back to its curated sleep, champagne in hand, eye masks on, noise-canceling headphones drowning out the world they built to silence others. Naomi was not surprised. America is always at its most dangerous when it sleeps. Then it began again. A scoff, a muttered complaint, the scrape of a shoe against the aisle floor. Douglas stood not to stretch, not to use the restroom, but to loom. He hovered at Naomi's armrest like a man inspecting a trespasser. His face wore the twisted mask of entitlement denied. "I'm going to say what everyone else is thinking," he said, low and bitter. "You don't belong here." Naomi's fingers curled slowly around the armrest. Her voice, when it came, was measured, because when you are black in America, even your dignity must pass through customs. "I'm not here for everyone else's comfort," she said. "I'm here for mine." And there it was. The true affront, the one that drives men like Douglas to madness. Not her presence, but her peace. Peace in the face of provocation. Peace that he could not buy or command. Peace that said, "I am not afraid of you." He leaned closer. "I want the flight crew to move you. You've made this whole section uncomfortable." And here, dear reader, is where the tragedy and the comedy of American racism collide. The man who starts the fire always complains about the smoke. Naomi lifted her gaze, eyes clear as frost. "You want me to move because your conscience can't." That line, those 12 words, turned the whole cabin into glass. People stirred. Eyes peeked over seats. A man, too, rose up, adjusted his headphones, suddenly listening. The couple across the aisle paused their film. For the first time, passengers began to see. The confrontation had a pulse now. Lauren returned, her face drawn. She asked Douglas to take his seat. He refused. "She's got her own security," he said, gesturing to the quiet presence of Jamal and Priya behind her. "What kind of person needs bodyguards on a plane?" Naomi said nothing, because sometimes silence is not surrender. It is a challenge. A steward stepped in. The purser, firm, diplomatic, asked Douglas again to sit. And Douglas, face flushed with wine and wounded pride, pointed directly at Naomi. "She's threatening me. With them." That, my friends, is the turning point in every story like this, the lie. The moment the aggressor casts themselves as the victim. It has happened on street corners, in courthouses, in lunch counters. And now here, above the clouds. But this time, the lie did not land as expected. Because Jamal stepped forward, not with violence, not with noise, but with authority. He flashed a credential, subtle, professional, indisputable. "We are licensed. Hired to protect Miss Clark. We do not initiate conflict." Lauren nodded. The purser took note. And the passengers, now fully awake, began to murmur. Douglas saw the tide turning. His voice rose in desperation. "I've paid more than anyone here. You think she belongs just because she has a damn entourage? This is a civilized cabin." And there, at last, was the word. Civilized. That ancient weapon wrapped in politeness. The word they wield when they mean white. The word that accuses blackness of disorder without naming it. Naomi stood, slowly, as if the altitude itself had made her weightless. "Sir," she said, her voice so even it felt like thunder. "I do not need to be civilized to prove I am human. But you might want to try it." Douglas blinked, stunned. The purser reached for the comm to call the captain, and Naomi turned back to her seat, not because she had been defeated, but because she had already won. You see, the fight for justice is not always in courts or protests. Sometimes it is in how we sit still when they tell us to move. Sometimes it is in how we breathe when they try to suffocate. And sometimes it is in how we refuse to leave the space we earned, because if we leave it, they will pretend we never belonged at all. Let us not deceive ourselves. There is a peculiar theater to American civility. It is a performance staged in lobbies and lounges, in first-class cabins and gated communities. The cast knows their lines. The audience pretends it isn't scripted. And yet, whenever a black woman refuses to bow, the stage creaks, the lights flicker, and someone always forgets their part. Naomi Clark had taken her place not just in a seat, but in a narrative that men like Douglas Weller believe they control. But the curtain was fraying now, the applause missing, and the truth, raw and uncomfortable, began to hover in the stale air. The captain had been informed. The purser had whispered into a discreet headset, and the flight crew moved with a new tempo, quick, deliberate, watchful. Naomi knew that rhythm. It was the same pace cops use when you're not the suspect, but also not the citizen. That uneasy speed between action and escalation. And she knew, too, that her dignity could not be left to airline protocol. It had to be protected by something older, resolved. Douglas still sat a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes narrowed into slits of bitter silence. But the quiet was no longer his. It belonged to the cabin now. People were awake, not just from sleep, but from the spell. An older woman across the aisle, perhaps in her 70s, leaned forward. Her hair was silver, her dress elegant. She looked at Naomi as if she'd known her all her life. "You're handling this beautifully," she whispered. Naomi gave a gentle nod. "But that's the heartbreak, isn't it? To be congratulated not for your intelligence or achievements, but for not breaking under someone else's ignorance." Jamal and Priya remained alert, still seated, but with eyes that missed nothing. Their presence was not just security, it was a statement. It said, "She is not alone." Lauren returned, this time with the purser, Miguel. Miguel had the face of a man who'd worked 100 red-eye flights and seen the worst of humanity sold at 35,000 feet. But this was different. He knelt slightly, not quite to the floor, and said in a low voice and rehearsed, "Miss Clark, we want you to know that we've logged the incident. And if Mr. Weller causes any more disruption, we are prepared to involve authorities upon landing." Naomi heard the message beneath the message. "We know. We saw. But we are also trying not to make it worse." And therein lies the American dilemma. They will recognize the fire, but still ask the burn to stay quiet until the embers cool. Naomi replied calmly, "Thank you. I trust you'll follow the procedure. But I also trust my safety does not require his permission." Miguel's eyes darted, then lowered. "Of course." Douglas scoffed aloud. "So now we're listening to her?" There it was again. Not a yell, not a slur, just that cold, clinical violence of disbelief. That a black woman could be right, could be defended, could be the one telling the truth. He leaned back. "This whole plane's gone soft." Naomi turned slowly in her seat. "No," she said, "it's just finally gotten asterisk loud enough to hear the parts you used to say under your breath." That line cut something. Passengers now looked fully. No more pretending. The man in one seat pulled off his headphones. The woman, too, rose ahead, turned her whole body around. And that silver-haired woman, quiet, stately, placed a hand on Naomi's arm. "You remind me of my daughter," she said softly, and her voice cracked. "But she didn't survive what you did." The moment held its breath. Not for drama, but for history, because that is what lives in every seat Naomi has ever taken. Her seat is not just leather and booking numbers, it's the culmination of Rosa Parks refusing to move, of Fannie Lou Hamer demanding to speak, of every black woman who chose presence over permission. The captain came on the intercom. A voice smooth, yet firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a temporary delay as we address an internal passenger concern. We thank you for your patience and understanding." Passenger concern. That's the language they always use when whiteness feels fragile. Concern. Not conflict. Not abuse. Not racism. Just concern. But Naomi wasn't concerned. She was clear. Clear that she wasn't moving. Clear that the danger was not her body, but the gaze fixed upon it. Clear that every seat she'd ever taken in life came with a price, and she had already paid it in full. She folded her arms. She breathed deep. And she waited. Because sometimes the most radical act you can commit is simply to stay where you are. Let us speak plainly, since the time for subtlety has passed. In America, a black person's presence is often mistaken for a disturbance, and dignity for defiance. As the plane sailed over the Atlantic, its lights dimmed and its passengers half asleep, one man's resentment burned like a flare left smoldering in the dark. But resentment, when left unchecked, does not stay a whisper. It grows teeth. Douglas Weller, now cornered by his own ego and the eyes of a cabin that would no longer look away, began to unravel. But he didn't do it loudly, oh no. Racism, when it fears exposure, becomes clever. It cloaks itself in protocol, wraps itself in concern, and stabs you while asking if you're all right. He pressed the attendant button. Ding. Lauren appeared, tired but professional. Yes, Mr. Weller? He gestured toward Naomi without looking at her. I'd like to request a reassignment, he said. For my comfort. Lauren hesitated. Sir, we are at full capacity. Then remove her security, he snapped. No one else in this cabin has bodyguards. Naomi didn't move. Jamal and Priya didn't flinch. The lie was already in motion. And that is the cruelty of it. The way black safety is treated as a threat, while white insecurity is coddled as a right. I don't feel safe, Douglas said, raising his voice just enough for others to hear. This is intimidation. Naomi looked to Miguel, the purser. The man now stood at a crossroads familiar to every institution that claims neutrality in the face of injustice. Would he honor truth or convenience? He cleared his throat. Mr. Weller, Miss Clark's companions are authorized. Their conduct has been entirely appropriate. Douglas leaned back, red-faced, snarling like a man who had been robbed of something, though he could not name it, because what he believed was stolen had never belonged to him in the first place. The cabin had shifted. Passengers once silent were no longer sleeping. A middle-aged black man in seat 2A adjusted his tie and looked straight at Douglas. She has more right to be here than you, he said. A white woman too rose down added, maybe you're the one who should be reassigned. Douglas turned toward Naomi, his voice cracking. You think you can bully your way into respect? That seat doesn't make you better. Naomi breathed in slowly, deeply. Neither does yours, she said. But your behavior makes you smaller. That, my dear listener, is when the veil ripped. Because here was a woman, black, brilliant, and unbothered, who did not cower, who did not explain, who did not move. And here was a man, accustomed to a world where women like her vanished in elevators, were silenced in meetings, were thanked for crumbs, and told to be grateful. He could not reconcile it. So he stood. Again. But this time, it was not to argue. It was to loom. He stepped into the aisle, toward Naomi, toward Jamal, toward a confrontation that no longer cared about masks. The passengers were tense. Priya stood. Jamal rose slowly, hands open but firm. Sir, step back, he said. I won't be threatened, Douglas barked. Not by her. Not by them. The word landed like a gunshot. And now the cabin knew what this had always been. Not about seating. Not about class. Not about comfort. It was about control. About who was allowed to exist without explanation. About who still believed they were master of the sky, even when the ground had shifted beneath them. The captain was notified. Airport authorities were called ahead. And Naomi, God bless her, sat still. Because she knew that when a black woman dares to remain seated in a world built to remove her, she does not need to shout. Her presence is the protest. Her composure is the storm. And her seat is a battleground. One she did not choose, but one she would never surrender. There comes a moment, even in this brittle theater of American civility, when the script collapses, when pretense can no longer cover the wound, when the ghost of decency, so often summoned but never fully present, must show its face. That moment had come. Douglas Weller now stood in the narrow aisle of that aircraft like a man ready to claim something that was never his. His voice, a bark hidden behind the veil of protocol, had grown ragged. And with every word, with every angry step toward Naomi Clark, he revealed what we who live in this skin already knew. He was never afraid of her. He was afraid of what she represented. A black woman who belonged. Not as servant. Not as symbol. But as sovereign. The plane was somewhere over the North Atlantic when the sky cracked, not outside, but inside. Douglas had moved too close. Jamal now stood fully between him and Naomi. Priya to the side, calm, calculated, but ready. Neither raised a hand. They didn't need to. The violence wasn't in fists. It was in the presumption that he could stand over her, accuse her, define her, and remain untouched. "Sit down," Jamal said, voice low like thunder in the distance. "You're endangering the cabin." Douglas turned red. "I'm not afraid of you," he snapped. Naomi, still seated, met his eyes and replied, "You should be afraid of what happens next. Not because of them. Because of you." Miguel, the purser, arrived. And behind him, a second flight attendant, then a whisper passed through the cabin. A ripple of awareness. The captain had been informed. The word diversion was quietly exchanged. Douglas scoffed. "You're going to land the plane because I asked a question?" But no one was asking questions anymore. They were issuing warnings. "I've filed reports," Lauren said. "Your behavior is documented. Your language. Your refusal to comply. It's over." But men like Douglas don't hear endings. They only hear insult. "She's playing the race card," he hissed. "You people always play the victim." Naomi stood. And let me tell you something about the way she rose. It wasn't angry. It wasn't violent. It was biblical. The kind of rising that makes cowards shrink. "I don't carry a race card," she said. "I carry a memory of every time a man like you told me I didn't belong." The silence in the cabin now was no longer passive. It was active. A verdict waiting to be read. Then came the moment of rupture. Miguel stepped forward, speaking into the intercom clipped to his collar. "Captain, this is the purser. We are requesting ground intervention upon landing. We have a passenger in violation of safety protocol." Douglas frozen. And, for the first time, he saw what we see every day. The thinness of his authority. The fragility of his assumed supremacy. Because when stripped of polite society, uniforms, and systems that cushion cruelty, what remained was just a man, unremarkable, loud, and lost. Naomi turned to sit again, but before she did, she said, "You'll walk off this plane before I do. And you'll remember the seat, because you tried to erase me from it." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The whole cabin heard her. They would hear her long after the plane touched ground. And in that moment, the reckoning wasn't just for Douglas. It was for every passenger who had watched in silence. It was for the crew who had to choose between comfort and conscience. It was for the country, flying above its own history, hoping no one looked down. But someone always does. And from that height, you don't see class, or prestige, or uniforms. You see truth. Ugly, uninvited, and finally descending. There is something sacred in the landing of an airplane. The hush before wheels kiss earth. The slow return to gravity. The quiet reminder that no matter how high we fly, we are still bound by history and by each other. But on this flight, the descent into New York was not just about geography. It was about reckoning. Douglas Weller sat stiff in his seat now, eyes forward, jaw locked. The performance of power had drained from his body, leaving behind something far more common and far more dangerous, the shame of a man unmasked. Around him, the cabin no longer looked away. There was no applause, no outburst, no confrontation. That's not how this country often handles its racism. Not in rooms lined with leather and linen. No, it simmers. In glances. In notes. In reports that read incident instead of injustice. Miguel returned quietly to Naomi's row. He bent down, his voice hushed. Authorities are meeting the plane. We've submitted everything. Naomi nodded. She was tired. Not the kind of tired you fix with sleep, but the kind that sinks into the marrow. Because the hardest part of confronting a man like Douglas isn't the moment he snaps. It's the knowledge that tomorrow another one just like him will board a different flight, speak the same script, and expect the same silence. And God help the one who dares answer him. The plane touched down. Smooth. Uneventful. Funny, isn't it, how the earth feels so solid when everything else in your life has been in turbulence. At the gate, no one moved. Until they arrived. 2 airport security officers. 1 airline representative. And a third man, tall, dark uniform, badge visible. They did not rush. Because America never rushes justice unless it wears a hoodie and runs too fast. Miguel stepped forward and gestured to Douglas. Mr. Weller, please gather your belongings. You could feel the air shift. Douglas stood slowly, like a man hoping he could still negotiate with inevitability. This is absurd, he muttered, over a disagreement. But even his voice had shrunk. He looked toward Naomi once more, perhaps searching for an ally, perhaps trying to rewrite the story in his head. But what he saw was a woman unmoved, not because she wasn't angry, not because she wasn't hurt, but because she had been here before. In boardrooms, in banks, in classrooms, and now in aisle 3A of a Delta aircraft, where she was once again expected to shrink so that someone else could stretch. Douglas was escorted off the plane. No applause, no fanfare, just the sound of footsteps retreating from the place he never owned. And still, Naomi did not exhale. Because she knew the problem wasn't Douglas. The problem was that half the cabin had waited until after the threat was gone to nod their approval. The man in 1C who offered a thumbs up. The young woman whispered, "You were so strong." The steward who now called her Dr. Clark, as though the title had suddenly become visible. It always comes too late. The courage, the solidarity, the recognition. Too late to stop the wound, just in time to help clean the blood. As the doors opened and passengers filed out, Naomi remained seated. Not because she needed rest, but because she needed space to remember herself before the world had tried to strip her down to a symbol. Jamal and Priya stood close by, shielding her not with arms, but with presence. Outside, the media waited. Someone had recorded the incident. The story had flown faster than the plane. But Naomi did not speak. Not yet. Because some stories are not told at baggage claim. They are told in courtrooms, in classrooms, in chapters. And this one wasn't finished. The truth, as I have lived it, is that America rarely asks for your story until it can turn it into a spectacle. Not until the bleeding has stopped. Not until the wound has become palatable enough for evening news, or poetic enough for the page. And now here stood Dr. Naomi Clark. Not as the victim. Not even as the victor. But as a woman who had refused to vanish. Outside JFK, the air was sharp with flashbulbs and whispers. Somewhere a voice called her name. Not ma'am, not excuse me, but Naomi, as though familiarity could erase the humiliation she had been forced to endure at 30,000 feet. Reporters wanted a statement. Civil rights groups issued hashtags. Airline spokespeople drafted apologies, bloated with words like misunderstanding and regrettable. But Naomi had lived long enough to know that racism in this country rarely regrets, it restructures. So she said nothing. Not at first. She went home. Not to rest, but to reckon. She sat in her brownstone living room, shoes off, head in hands. And she listened. Not to the news, but to the silence of her own spirit asking, what now? The phone rang for days. Networks. Newspapers. Influencers. Everyone wanted the soundbite. Everyone wanted the photo of the graceful, composed black woman who had handled herself with poise. But what they really wanted was proof that she had forgiven. Because forgiveness in America is the favorite burden it places on Black shoulders. And Naomi wasn't ready to carry that, not yet. Maybe not ever. A week passed. Then two. And then the letters began. From strangers. From elders. From teachers in rural towns who showed the video to their classes. From a retired nurse in Mississippi who wrote, "You reminded me I wasn't crazy for remembering how they used to look at us." Some sent prayers. Some sent poems. But one letter, one, pierced deeper than the rest. It was handwritten in unsteady cursive. "Dear Dr. Clark, I am the daughter of Douglas Weller. I don't expect you to read this, but I needed to tell you that what happened on that plane broke something in me, something I hadn't realized was still alive. My father raised me to believe the world was ours, not to share. I see now that he was wrong. I am sorry, not just for his behavior, but for mine, in all the silent moments I could have spoken and didn't. Thank you for not disappearing." Naomi wept, not because the letter was redemptive, but because it was honest. And then she spoke. Not on television, not in a press release, but on a stage in a Harlem church with wooden pews and worn hymnals, where truth still echoed louder than applause. She stood before an intergenerational crowd, gray-haired veterans of resistance and bright-eyed youth who carried protest signs in their backpacks. She told them everything. Not just what happened in Seat 3A, but what it felt like to be asked to explain her own existence. What it meant to be followed in stores as a teenager, to be called articulate in meetings, to be mistaken for the help in her own home when contractors arrived. She told them what it costs to sit down in America when you are expected to stand up and smile through it all. And then she asked them a question. "What seat are you still asking permission to occupy?" The room went still. Because she wasn't just talking about airplanes anymore. She was talking about boardrooms, voting booths, hospital beds, classrooms, and dinner tables. She was talking about the places we are told we are too much for, too loud, too dark, too angry, too ambitious, too present. And with that, she ended. "This seat I kept? It wasn't just mine. It was my mother's, my grandmother's, every woman who stood so I could sit. And if ever you are told to move, remember this. Your presence is not the problem. Their discomfort is not your burden, and you do not need to be less so they can be more." They rose to their feet, not out of politeness, but because they had finally been seen. And maybe that is the point, not justice in a courtroom or policy change that moves too slowly to catch the real harm, but testimony. That someone saw it, that someone stayed, that someone spoke. Naomi Clark boarded many planes after that. Some flights were quiet. Some weren't. But no matter where she sat, she never again sat alone. Because dignity, once reclaimed, does not ask permission. It takes its seat. And it stays.